Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before the entire hospital watched him lose everything. Seattle General in Portland hums with the sterile rhythm of fluorescent lights buzzing over linoleum, antiseptic cutting through the air like a blade. The ER moves in controlled chaos, nurses in scrubs moving between bays, the ventilator in trauma 3 wheezed its mechanical rhythm, a stretcher squeaked down the corridor with someone's blood still wet on the rails. Katie Rodriguez moves through it like a shadow, invisible, her hand steady as she hangs for bags and checks vitals with unusual precision that makes the other nurses pause and watch without knowing why. She arrives at 6:51 a.m. like she does every shift, badge clipped to her scrubs, and walks directly to her locker in the break room. The locker is small, institutional gray metal, and inside sits a single personal item, a pair of worn combat boots. The leather is cracked and faded, the soles worn thin from 1,000 miles of terrain that doesn't exist on any civilian map. Katie touches them briefly before each shift, her fingers running across the toe box as if checking they're still real, as if checking that some part of her actual life still exists in this place where she is nobody. A faint scar runs from her collarbone down into her scrubs, the kind of scar that tells a story nobody asks about. Her fingers never tremble. Not during the worst traumas. Not ever. Dr. Caldwell arrives at 7:15 a.m. like a man who owns the place, because in a sense, he does. Silver hair cut with institutional precision, tailored white coat that probably cost more than Katie makes in a week, the kind of presence that makes air pressure change when he enters a room. He's been the ER chief for 19 years, and in that time he's built a reputation the way generals build empires, through hierarchy, through control, through the careful cultivation of people who owe him favors. The nurses defer to him instantly. The residents fear him. Even the attending physicians calculate before they speak in his presence. What Caldwell cannot stand is uncertainty. And Katie Rodriguez is nothing but uncertainty wrapped in scrubs. He watches her from the nurse's station, jaw working as she checks the whiteboard for patient assignments. He doesn't like how the other nurses defer to her quiet competence, how she anticipates orders before they're given, how patients relax the moment she enters a room even though she barely speaks. He's been here 19 years. He's the one who should command that kind of unspoken respect. Instead, 3 weeks into this quiet nobody's employment, the ER has started running like a machine that doesn't need his constant input, and Caldwell has spent nearly 2 decades proving that everything runs through him. At 7:43 a.m., standing in the nurse's station with 4 other staff members present, Caldwell makes his move. "I'm putting down $50, he says, loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough for Katie to hear from the medication cart 15 feet away where she's restocking supplies. $50 that our new friend here doesn't make it through the week. Anyone want that action?" He says it with the confidence of a man who has made 1,000 small bets and won most of them. The confidence of institutional power. The other nurses laugh nervously, the way people laugh at jokes told by people who can end their careers with a phone call. Katie's hands pause for 1.2 seconds. Not freezing. Not trembling. A pause. Then they continue moving, syringes into the drawer, for needles organized with methodical precision. Her jaw doesn't clench. Her breathing doesn't change. She doesn't turn around. She doesn't acknowledge that she heard him. The other nurses watch her, waiting for a reaction, and when one doesn't come, they turn back to their work, and the moment passes like a small stone dropped into still water. Caldwell's mouth tightens. He'd expected something. A flinch. An apology. A crack in the facade. Instead, there was nothing. Just that pause. Just those steady hands. At 12:17 p.m., in the hospital cafeteria, Caldwell makes his second move. Katie sits alone at a corner table with a tray containing a turkey sandwich, apple slices, and water. She eats methodically, the way someone eats who has been trained to refuel efficiently, minimal time, maximum nutrition. She does not look at her phone. She does not look around the room. She eats like someone who has eaten in conditions where being aware of your surroundings is the only thing keeping you breathing. Caldwell approaches her table with 2 residents trailing behind him like satellites. He's on his way back from some meeting or another, and the cafeteria is crowded enough that no one will be able to say exactly what happened, just that it did. He leans over her shoulder, close enough that she can smell the expensive cologne, close enough that she can see his reflection in the water glass. My, he says, voice pitched for the people around them. 37 minutes into lunch. Someone's slow. And then his hand, deliberate and controlled, sweeps across the edge of her tray. The turkey sandwich tumbles. The apple slices scatter across the tile floor like red planets losing orbit. The water glass tips, spilling across the plastic tray, soaking what remains of her meal. The residents flinch. 2 nearby nurses stop mid-conversation. Caldwell is already moving away, professional distance restored, when he turns back and drops a patient chart at her feet. It lands face down on the wet cafeteria tile, and he smiles like a man who has just won a game she didn't know they were playing. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he says, the words dripping with a particular kind of condescension that is designed to sting. "And try not to track water all over the hospital." Katie sits motionless for 3 full seconds. The room is watching. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead with their eternal hum. Someone's tray rattles. Someone else coughs. But the space around Katie's table is silent, the kind of silence that comes from witnessing something you're not sure you're allowed to acknowledge. Then her hands move. She stands. She doesn't look at Caldwell. She bends and retrieves the patient chart from the wet floor, the pages already beginning to curl from the water. She stands and places it on the edge of her ruined tray. Her hands are steady. Her jaw is set, but not clenched. Her breathing is controlled. She carries her tray to the waste bin, disposes of the broken meal, and wipes her hands on a paper towel with the kind of precision that suggests she's done this before, survived worse than this before. Her eyes are flat, empty, the eyes of someone whose interior landscape is not available for inspection. She walks back past Caldwell's table without looking at him, and she continues walking out of the cafeteria. One of the residents whispers something to Caldwell. He doesn't respond. He's watching Katie's back disappear through the cafeteria doors, expecting something. Expecting rage. Expecting tears. Expecting any of the things that normal people do when they've been humiliated in front of 32 witnesses. What he gets instead is nothing. Absolute nothing. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling he didn't see because there was no trembling. The restraint he didn't recognize because it looked like indifference. By 1:15 p.m., Katie is standing beside the bed in room 314, taking vitals on a 4-star general recovering from routine bypass surgery. The general is 73 years old, decorated Special Forces commander, the kind of man who has survived 3 wars and a helicopter crash, and right now he's drowsy from medication and doesn't really look at the nurse checking his blood pressure. His left forearm rests on the blanket, and on that forearm, a tattoo, Cade Rodriguez. The initials are bold, black, permanent, the kind of tattoo a man gets when he needs to remember something he can never forget. He had no idea that the woman adjusting his fall line was the operator who'd carried him 3 miles through enemy fire in Bagram. Master Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez officially doesn't exist anymore, her records buried so deep that even she can't prove who she used to be. That life ended in a classified operation that failed, and she was ordered to disappear. The government made her a ghost. Gave her a new identity, gave her a new life, gave her nothing else. The tattoo was the last time anyone spoke her name aloud. Katie notes his vitals, BP 118/74, heart rate 68, O2 sat 97 on room air, and she's writing them on his chart when the general shifts slightly in the bed, and for a moment his eyes focus on her face. Recognition flickers across his expression, something deep and ancient. But then the medication pulls him back under, and he closes his eyes, and the moment passes. Katie's hand doesn't pause on the chart. Her face doesn't change. She finishes writing, checks his foresight once more, no signs of infiltration, and she leaves room 314 without a word. She doesn't know that he'll remember the moment later when he's more awake. She doesn't know that he'll spend the next 16 hours staring at his tattooed arm, trying to reconcile the face of the woman from that operation with the face of the nurse who just took his vitals. She doesn't know that recognition is coming. What she knows is that room 314 is stable, that her shift continues, that Dr. Caldwell is somewhere in this hospital still waiting for her to break. The next voice they heard would change everything. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Caldwell would do when he realized she wasn't going to quit on her own. The morning rounds began at 6:45, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical monotone above the nursing station where Dr. Caldwell gathered 6 nurses and 3 residents like a general assembling his court. His voice carried across the floor with the precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed, his tailored white coat hanging like a cape. "I'll bet anyone here $50 that our quiet little nobody Rodriguez quits within a week," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the corridor where Katie was restocking the supply cart. "She doesn't have what it takes for real medicine. Look at her, afraid to make eye contact, afraid to speak. That's not a nurse. That's a ghost." Laughter rippled through the group. One resident, a cocky third-year named Mitchell, actually clapped Caldwell on the shoulder like they'd just shared a private joke. Katie walked past 3 minutes later carrying a stack of sterile gauze pads and fluid bags, her jaw clenching once, so briefly that only someone trained in reading micro-expressions would have caught it. Her hands remained perfectly steady. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality, the kind of composure that comes from swallowing things that would make most people scream. She continued to the supply closet without breaking stride, without acknowledging that she'd heard anything at all, without giving Caldwell the satisfaction of a flinch. That was his first mistake, assuming her silence meant weakness. The cafeteria at noon was crowded, 80 people scattered across tables in conversations that created the white noise of a functioning hospital. Katie sat alone in the corner, a ritual of professional distance, eating soup from a ceramic bowl and reviewing discharge protocols on her phone. She didn't see Caldwell until his elbow connected with hers, a deliberate, forceful bump that sent her entire tray airborne. Soup splashed across the tile in a wide arc, silverware clattering like weapons dropped on a battlefield, the bowl shattering into 3 pieces. The noise cut through conversation like a gunshot. Everyone turned. 40 staff members watched as Caldwell stood above her, smirking, holding a patient chart. "Clumsy," he said, his voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "That's what happens when people aren't trained properly. Pick that up, sweetheart." That's what nurses do, they pick things up. They serve. They clean. They don't ask questions. The room went absolutely still. Katie's hands were in her lap. Her eyes found his face and held there for 3 full seconds without moving, her expression unreadable as stone, her breathing controlled and deliberate. Then she dropped the chart he was holding at her feet, not violently, simply released it from his hand to the floor, and watched it land beside the soup. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd calculated 17 different ways this encounter could end, and had chosen the one that kept her invisible. She kneeled slowly, her knees cracking slightly as they bent, and retrieved the shattered pieces of the bowl one by one, placing them carefully in her napkin. She picked up the patient chart, wiped soup from its cover with deliberate care, and stood without looking at Caldwell again. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. She walked to the trash receptacle, disposed of the debris, and carried the dampened chart to the nurse's station to file it properly, her spine straight, her movements precise. She left her ruined lunch on the table. She worked the rest of her shift, for more hours, as if nothing had happened. She changed bandages in rooms 307 through 412. She documented vital signs. She responded to call lights. She functioned like a machine that had been programmed to ignore humiliation. That night in her car in the parking garage, the engine dead, her forehead pressed against the steering wheel, her hands finally shook. They trembled against the worn leather, the adrenaline crash that came hours after the insult, after she'd maintained composure long enough that her nervous system had no choice but to betray her in private. Her shoulders tensed. Her breathing came in controlled measures, pulling it back under control, refusing to let fear have her, refusing to let Caldwell have her. By morning, her face was stone again. During evening rounds 2 days later, Caldwell cornered her in the medication room, a space barely larger than a closet, lined with locked cabinets and the smell of antiseptic so strong it burned the back of the throat. She was counting narcotics for the shift log, her pen moving in perfectly straight lines down a government form, each numeral precise. Caldwell tossed a stack of charts onto the counter beside her with enough force that one slid across the surface and nearly fell off the edge. "I don't know what backwater clinic let you pretend to be a real nurse," he said, his voice low now, intimate in its cruelty, the kind of tone reserved for conversations no one else was meant to hear. "But here we have standards. We have protocols. You're barely qualified to empty bedpans." Katie's pen continued its work. She finished the line she was writing, set the pen down with careful precision, and met his eyes. Her voice, when it came, was steady as a surgical laser. "Yes, doctor." That was all. She returned to counting, and Caldwell left because he'd expected a reaction, fear, argument, tears, and received instead the absolute indifference of someone for whom his words carried no weight. Which infuriated him more than any comeback could have. That was when Caldwell began his real work. That was when he stopped relying on public humiliation and started weaponizing the institution itself. The board member was a cardiologist named Dr. Richard Sterling, someone Caldwell had mentored 15 years earlier, someone who still remembered favors. They met on a Wednesday afternoon in the hospital's private dining room on the 4th floor, the kind of space where decisions that affected other people's lives were made over salads that cost more than most nurses earned in an hour. Caldwell opened his leather folio and spread out the pieces of his case like evidence at a crime scene. "I have concerns about a new hire," he said, his voice taking on the tone of a man genuinely worried. "A nurse named Katie Rodriguez." The credential check seemed thin. "Previous employers that don't quite check out. I wanted to bring it to you quietly before I escalate, because if there's an actual compliance issue, we need to know." Sterling nodded, making notes. He owed Caldwell. He would look into it. The investigation began methodically. Caldwell called the clinic in rural Montana first, the one that had been Katie's official last employer. The woman who answered confirmed employment dates and little else. She did her job, the administrator said. Good nurse. Quiet. Left for Portland. Caldwell pressed for specifics, for performance reviews, for anything that might contradict his narrative. The records were sparse. They were always sparse because Katie's real employers, the ones before Bagram, during Bagram, the ones who'd given her the order to disappear, had ensured that her paper trail would be carefully fragmented across facilities too small or too removed to compare notes. It was perfect security. It looked, from the outside, like a thin employment history. He filed his first official complaint with HR on Friday morning. The allegation was specific and measurable. Katie had allegedly administered medication without proper authorization in room for 28, a pain management protocol that should have required a physician's countersign. Ellen Marsh, the HR director, opened a file and began the documentation process, her tone professional, neutral, the tone of someone following procedure rather than someone making judgment. But the file existed. The paper trail had begun. The next step was the outside investigator. Caldwell placed a call to a man named Harrison Webb, a former hospital administrator who'd left his last position under circumstances that were never quite clarified but seemed to involve questions about financial oversight and a generous severance package. Webb owed Caldwell a significant favor. They met for coffee, and Caldwell outlined his concerns about Katie's nursing credentials and compliance protocols. I'd like an independent audit, Caldwell said. Just her cases. Just for the past month. I want to know if there are patterns of protocol violations. Keep it quiet. Webb agreed. He would begin the audit on Monday. Katie felt the walls closing without understanding their shape. She felt them in the way the nurses who'd been friendly now looked away when she passed. She felt them in the way medication orders came back with questions attached. She felt them in the shift assignments, the most difficult cases, the terminal patients, the ones that required 12 hours of intensive one-on-one care, began appearing on her schedule with increasing frequency, each one potentially a trap, each one a chance to make a mistake that could justify what was already being constructed against her. She couldn't defend herself without revealing the truth. She couldn't explain her thin employment history without admitting that Master Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez officially didn't exist anymore, that her records were buried so deep in classified archives that even she couldn't prove who she'd been. The orders after Bagram had been absolute: disappear completely, or the Taliban intelligence operatives who'd survived would find her family, find her mother in Sacramento, find her brother in Denver, and make her watch what they did to them. So she worked. She kept her composure. She did her job better than anyone else in the hospital could do it, and she waited for the moment when hidden strength would finally be allowed to become visible. The morning of her 8th shift, Katie found a message in her locker. A handwritten note, folded once, unsigned. "They're building something against you. Be careful." She read it once, then burned it in the medication room sink, watching the paper blacken and crumble, and returned to work without asking who'd sent it, understanding only that at least one person had been watching, had understood, had tried to warn her. But the machinery was already in motion. The machinery was already in motion, and Caldwell had learned long ago that momentum was cheaper than mercy. 3 days after Katie burned the warning in the medication room sink, he arranged lunch with Dr. Marcus Pierce, the hospital's board-appointed cardiologist, in the private dining room on the 4th floor, the kind of space where decisions happened behind closed doors and nobody asked questions. The room smelled of lemon polish and old money, the kind of sterile comfort that came from knowing your name was on the building's donor wall. Caldwell slid a folder across the mahogany table. Inside were copies of Katie's sparse employment history, the gaps between positions highlighted in yellow like accusations. "I'm concerned about her credential verification," he said, his voice measured, surgical. "Look at these employment gaps. 2016 to 2018, nothing. 2019 to 2022, spotty at best. And her references are military contractors, shell organizations mostly. Nobody's hearing back from them." He watched Pierce's face, reading the small nod that meant agreement was forming. "I'm not saying anything definitive. I'm just saying, in a liability environment like ours, we should know who we're employing." Pierce leaned back, the leather chair creaking like a small animal surrendering. "You want HR to take a closer look?" "I want what's best for the hospital," Caldwell said. And he meant it, though what was best for the hospital and what was best for Caldwell had become difficult to separate. That same afternoon, Caldwell picked up his phone and made 5 calls. The first 2 went to Katie's previous employers, a clinic in Olympia and a staffing agency in Seattle. He didn't ask questions, he asked them. His tone was the kind that made people uncomfortable, the kind that made them provide the least information possible rather than risk saying something wrong. "I'm simply verifying her work history," he said to each one. "We need confirmation of employment dates and performance ratings." When they hesitated, he added quietly, "For our records. For liability purposes." The hesitation turned into capitulation. By the time he hung up, both employers had provided nothing more than confirmation that yes, Katie Rodriguez had worked there, and no, they had no specific details to share. The third call went to Ellen Marsh in Human Resources. "Ellen, I need a compliance review on one of our newer nurses. Employment history with some gaps that concern me. I'm going to have our investigator take a deeper look, but I wanted you prepared." He spelled out Katie's name carefully, as if it were a diagnosis. "Preliminary screening, nothing formal yet. Just due diligence." Ellen's voice came back cautious, trained. "Do you have specific concerns, or is this routine?" "Routine due diligence," Caldwell said, which was technically true, though routine was a word that could mean almost anything when you wielded it correctly. "But I'd feel better if we had someone independent verify her credentials before we proceed." The fourth call was to Investigative Solutions, a firm he'd used twice before for background checks on hospital vendors. This time, he was clearer. "I need a comprehensive employment history verification. Focus on the gaps. Look for inconsistencies in her work history, credential fabrication, anything that doesn't add up." He gave them Katie's file. "She's been here 3 weeks. I need preliminary findings within a week. The fifth call was to himself, not literally, but to the calculation he'd made the moment Katie walked into Seattle General. Some people you could break with public humiliation. Some you had to break with institutions. Katie was the latter. She was the kind of quiet that didn't respond to noise. She was the kind that required the grinding weight of bureaucratic machinery, the kind that left no marks but crushed just the same. By Thursday morning, the compliance investigator had submitted his preliminary report. 18 pages. The language was careful, measured, the kind of language that looked objective until he realized every sentence was structured to suggest dishonesty. Employment gaps spanning multiple years without documented explanation. Previous employers unable to provide detailed performance records. Credential verification incomplete pending further investigation. Suspicious employment history suggests possible credential fabrication and may warrant further scrutiny. The report didn't accuse Katie of anything. It just made it very difficult to imagine she wasn't guilty of something. Caldwell printed it and read it twice, his smile spreading like a stain. He'd suggested some of this language during his meeting with the investigator, nothing direct, just nudges in conversation. The gaps are what concern me, he'd said. In nursing, if you can't account for your time, well, that's worth noting. The investigator had nodded, understanding without being told that this was a case worth pursuing. At 2:41 p.m. on Friday, Katie received a message from Ellen Marsh's office, performance review meeting, Monday 10 a.m. HR Conference Room B, a preliminary employment verification discussion. No other context. Just those words, sterile as a procedure note, and they meant everything. Katie read the message twice, then deleted it, her face revealing nothing. She was shelving linens in the supply closet when she got it, and she finished shelving linens. Muscle memory took over, fold, stack, organize. The motions were simple enough that her hands could move on their own while her mind calculated what Monday meant. Performance review. Preliminary. Employment verification. These were the words they used when they'd already decided. Caldwell had made another strategic move, one that Katie wouldn't know about until the review. He'd requested that the general's care be reassigned to the day shift rotation only, keeping Katie's access limited to medication administration and vital sign checks. He'd written in the chart, in his careful physician's script, patient requires continuity of care from established team. New staff to assist with routine post-op monitoring only. It wasn't a lie. It was just a boundary drawn in a way that served his purposes. He'd also ordered the general's room floor changed from 4B to 4D, moving him to the opposite wing of the floor, farther from where Katie typically worked, ensuring that when she did have access, it would be brief and circumscribed. What Caldwell couldn't account for was that Katie had been checking the telemetry monitor from the nurse's station every evening. The general's heart rhythm had begun showing small irregularities, occasional premature ventricular contractions, a pattern that suggested stress on the cardiac tissue or early warning of something larger. On Thursday night, Katie had documented it. Telemetry shows increasing frequency of PVCs during evening hours. Recommend immediate cardiology consult to rule out arrhythmia progression. She'd written the note carefully, medically precise, the kind of observation any competent nurse would make. Caldwell had read her note Saturday morning and crossed it out with his pen, his script aggressive and final, nurse overreach, disregard. Continue routine monitoring only. He'd written it in red ink, the color of correction, the color of rejection. Then he'd added another line to the chart restricting Katie's access, assessment and evaluation limited to assigned parameters. Medication administration only. No independent recommendations to cardiology or other departments without physician authorization. The words were written like walls. Katie read them when she came in for the evening shift, and her jaw clenched imperceptibly, the only visible response, and a small enough response that nobody who didn't know what to look for would have noticed. She continued her rounds. The general was sleeping, his monitors beeping their steady rhythm. She administered his evening medications without comment, adjusted his checked his lines. Her hands were steady. Her face was blank. But something had shifted in her eyes, a small hardening, the way metal looks right before it breaks. That night, in the apartment she'd rented month to month, Katie pulled out a folder she'd kept buried in the bottom of her closet, discharge papers from Bagram, paperwork that officially ended a life that was supposed to be erased. The documents bore her name, Catherine Rodriguez, Master Chief Petty Officer, Naval Special Warfare Command, Honorable Discharge, Official Classification Level Unknown. The papers were supposed to be destroyed. The orders had been explicit. But Katie had kept them, some part of her unable to let go of proof that she'd existed, that the life before the silence had been real. She held them over the kitchen sink, lighter in her other hand. The flame was small, blue at the base, orange at the tip. All she had to do was lower the papers into the heat and let the fire do what she should have let it do 3 years ago. All she had to do was let go. But her hands didn't move. The lighter trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of restraint. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the weight of a decade of service trying to burn away a life that wouldn't stay buried. She lowered the lighter, blew out the flame, and set the papers back on the counter. Then she sat at the kitchen table in the dark, the documents in front of her like an accusation, like a confession, like the only proof left that any of it had been real. At 6:43 a.m. on Monday, Katie's hands were steady as she tied her scrubs. By 9:50 a.m., she was walking toward HR Conference Room B, her worn combat boots silent on the hospital tile, the only object in her possession that carried the weight of everything she'd had to become to survive. Caldwell had no idea what was walking toward him. He had no idea that the quiet nurse he'd been methodically destroying had already survived things that would have killed most people. But the machinery was still turning, and on Monday morning, it was going to grind forward, and nobody could stop it, not yet, anyway. The door to Conference Room B was waiting. The monitor screamed at 2:51 p.m. Katie was 20 feet away, restocking supplies in the medication alcove on the 4th floor when the alarm pierced through the ordinary rhythm of Seattle General, one sustained shriek from room 314 that made her spine go rigid. Flat line. No hesitation. She moved instantly, her body already shifting toward the sound before her conscious mind finished processing the tone. The crash cart was 6 steps away. The code button was 8. She covered both distances before anyone else turned their head. Room 314 belonged to the 4-star general, the decorated Special Forces commander whose presence had made Dr. Caldwell visibly uncomfortable for the past 3 weeks. The general lay motionless, his chest rising and falling in the mechanical rhythm of the sleeping sedated. Now the monitor showed nothing but a flat green line, the absence of electrical activity that meant the heart had simply stopped. No pulse. No respiration. Pupils fixed and dilated like coins pressed into his skull. Katie's hands moved through the practice sequence, oxygen mask, crash cart crash open, the defibrillation pads placed with precision across his sternum. 90 seconds. That's how long the brain tolerates cardiac arrest before permanent damage begins spreading through the tissue like spilled ink through water. Dr. Caldwell stood in the doorway, frozen, his face the color of old institutional walls. His mouth opened and closed without sound. The monitors beeped their useless algorithms around him. Code blue, room 314, code blue, Katie announced, her voice cutting through the noise with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. She slammed the defibrillation button. The general's body arched as electricity coursed through him. The monitor remained flat. She charged again. Flat. Again. Nothing. Standard protocol wasn't working because the problem wasn't electrical, it was mechanical. The heart wasn't fibrillating. It had simply stopped contracting. Defibrillation would never restart a stop pump. She had maybe 60 seconds before brain death became inevitable. Rodriguez, stop! Caldwell's voice finally found its volume. Stop, you are not authorized, wait for the team. But Katie's hands were already moving. She grabbed the surgical kit from the crash cart, tore open the sterile field with her teeth, and poured betadine across the general's exposed chest in a broad amber sweep. The antiseptic smell, sharp, chemical, unforgiving, filled the small room. She made the incision in one long deliberate motion, blade singing through skin and muscle with the kind of precision that only comes from muscle memory carved into bone through thousands of repetitions. The rib spreader came next, the metal scraping against bone as she cracked his ribs open like a book binding under pressure. Katie didn't flinch at the sound. The sound was information. The sound meant access. The sound meant she still had time. She reached into the open chest cavity with her bare hand, no glove, no hesitation, and felt the useless heart beneath her palm. Cold. Slack. Like holding a fist that had forgotten how to squeeze. She began direct cardiac massage, compressing the general's heart manually in perfect rhythm, squeezing and releasing, while her other hand managed the ambibag, her voice calling out pressures and timing as though she were in a classroom instead of racing against cellular death. The entire fourth floor had gathered at the glass observation wall. 40 faces pressed against the transparent barrier like a crowd witnessing something they weren't supposed to see. Several phones were recording. Katie saw the blue light reflecting off open faces, the stunned silence of staff members watching the quiet nurse they'd been told would quit in a week perform the kind of procedure that lived in operating rooms, not patient floors. Caldwell's face had drained of all color. He backed against the hallway wall, his confidence suddenly looking like camouflage that had been torn away. Katie maintained her rhythm. 90 seconds of compression. 120. The general's heart spasmed beneath her palm, not from her efforts, but from something that might have been electrical activity rekindling on its own. She adjusted her grip, modified the angle of compression, felt the muscle beginning to respond to the stimulation instead of the dead weight it had been. 150. The rhythm strengthened. She felt the heart contract on its own, felt it pushing blood instead of receiving it. Strong rhythm. Purposeful. Alive. She slowly withdrew her hand as the code team crashed through the door with the kind of controlled chaos that only comes from training, from muscle memory shaped by 1,000 simulations. The cardiology resident reached for the general's chest. Katie stepped back, her hand dripping blood down to her elbows, her face perfectly expressionless, her voice steady as she reported vitals and timing and the exact moment the heart had resumed independent rhythm. The monitors beside the bed showed normal sinus rhythm, the electrical activity of a heart that had returned to the business of living. Within 2 hours, the HR notice was waiting for Katie in the hallway, delivered by a security officer whose expression suggested he had no interest in the actual content of the suspension letter. Unauthorized invasive procedures, the document read, typed in the bureaucratic language of institutions protecting themselves. Medical practice outside scope of nursing license. Pending disciplinary review. Effective immediately. Badge surrender required. Katie handed over her identification without a word. She didn't request a meeting. She didn't ask for clarification. She simply removed the badge from her pocket, placed it on the security officer's outstretched hand, and walked toward the parking garage while the hallway traffic parted around her like water around a stone. Staff members watched from doorways, their faces showing something between shock and something else, something that looked almost like regret. No one called after her. No one offered support. The institution had spoken, and the institution's voice was the only one that mattered in corridors painted institutional beige. The parking garage was dim, lit by fluorescent tubes that buzzed like dying insects. Her car, a 2008 Honda Civic in midnight blue, parked in the same spot for 3 weeks, sat empty and waiting. Katie opened the driver's side door, slid into the seat, and closed her eyes. The engine was dead. She didn't start it. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, her hands finally beginning to shake, not the trembling of fear, but the trembling of restraint finally releasing, of composure finally cracking in the only place it was allowed to crack. Alone. In the dark. Where no one could see. Her hands moved through the memory of it, the feel of the general's heart beneath her palm, the weight of muscle that didn't belong to her body but had become her responsibility anyway. She couldn't defend herself without revealing the truth. The moment she said Devgru, the moment she said Bagram, the moment she said classified operation, every protection she had would collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. The Pentagon had been clear. Master Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez officially didn't exist anymore. The operation in Bagram had never happened. The 17 operators she'd carried through enemy fire had been officially reclassified as a classified incident that couldn't be discussed, couldn't be mentioned, couldn't be acknowledged in any way that would connect Katie's former identity to her current existence. Which meant she couldn't prove who she was. Which meant she couldn't explain how she knew what she knew. Which meant she was going to be destroyed by an institution that could be defeated only by telling the truth that would destroy her. The rain started sometime after midnight, hammering the parking garage roof like applause from a crowd she couldn't see. Katie's hands finally stopped shaking. She pressed her forehead harder against the steering wheel and waited for morning, unable to move, unable to fight an enemy she couldn't identify without destroying the only cover that kept her alive. The engine stayed dead. The rain kept falling. And somewhere above her, in a hospital bed on the 4th floor, a 4-star general slept with new stitches closing a chest that a woman with worn combat boots had cracked open to save his life. He had no idea who she was. He had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The next morning arrived like a verdict. Katie was restocking the trauma supply cart at 8:44 a.m. when the ER doors slid open and a construction worker limped through with a lacerated forearm, bleeding into a towel wrapped around his wrist. She glanced up from the 4 bags. The man's face went white, not from pain, but from recognition. His lips moved silently. Then came the whisper, so quiet it almost didn't exist, "Whiskey 6." The supply cart went still in her hands. She didn't turn. Didn't flinch. Didn't acknowledge. She simply placed the last bag on the shelf and moved toward the triage desk as though she hadn't heard a language she hadn't spoken in 4 years. But her hands knew. Her body knew. The name was a call sign, not hers exactly, but it belonged to the operation at Bagram, the one that didn't officially exist, the one that had cost her everything and given her a new life in hiding. The construction worker, Taliban fighter, her mind registered without malice, just data, was being moved to Trauma 3 when Marcus, the security guard, stepped out of the break room. Marcus had been 75th Ranger Regiment, 23 years of service, and he had the particular radar that came from having survived things that civilians couldn't imagine. He overheard the man's next sentence to the intake nurse, "I need to see her. The one who pulled us out. Whiskey 6. She saved 17 of us that night." Marcus's body language changed. Not dramatically, no sudden movement, no shock, just a recalibration. A shift in how he held his shoulders. He walked to the trauma bay and looked at Katie, really looked at her, for the first time in 6 weeks of passing in hallways. His eyes moved across her face like he was reading something that had been written there all along but had required the right key to decode. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez," Marcus said to the room. His voice carried the weight of someone speaking an oath. "Special Warfare Operator. Navy SEAL." The trauma bay froze. A nurse's hand stopped mid-motion. The cardiac monitor's beeping seemed to get louder, as if the machines were the only things still permitted to function. Katie kept her hands on the supply shelf where they'd landed. She didn't turn around. She didn't correct him. She didn't deny anything because denial would have been a betrayal of the truth that someone had finally spoken aloud. The door to room 314 opened. The 4-star general, the man she'd carried 3 miles through enemy fire, the man whose name she'd memorized in blood and sand, was wheeling his Fastan toward the trauma bay. His chest was wrapped in bandages from where her hands had split his ribs open 36 hours ago. His face was the color of old paper, but his voice was steady as a combat radio. "Bring me her service record," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Within an hour, calls had been made to the Pentagon, to the classified archives where Katie's file had been buried so deep that even she couldn't access it. The general sat on his hospital bed reading from printed pages that should never have been printed, pages that detailed a career that had been erased. His voice rose and fell like he was conducting an orchestra of consequences. 6 commendations for Valor, he read. Pause. Staff members in the hallway stopped moving. For Purple Hearts. Another pause. Longer this time. The silence pressed against the walls like pressure. Operation Shepherd, Bagram Airfield, Classified Directive 7 Blue. Extraction of 14 personnel and 17 civilian refugees under sustained fire. Casualty rate, 0. He looked up from the papers. His eyes found Katie through the doorway, and for the first time, he saw her. Really saw her. Recognition hit him like shrapnel. That was you. That was her, Marcus confirmed from the doorway. The general lifted his sleeve. His arm was still swollen from the 4 lines, still marked with the pale tape residue of the monitors they'd removed after she brought him back from clinical death. But below all that, permanent as bone, was the tattoo he'd gotten the night before deployment, K. Rodriguez, in letters that looked like they'd been carved by someone who needed to remember a name more than he needed to breathe. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum above them, that electric whisper that most people never noticed but that filled the silence like something alive. 10 seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Katie stood in the doorway of room 314 wearing rumpled blue scrubs and white sneakers, her hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail she'd worn every shift since arriving at Seattle General, and she was suddenly visible in a way that made the entire hospital rearrange itself around her. "Someone call the FBI," the general said. Not to the room. To his phone. "My name is General Marcus Whitmore, retired, Special Forces Command. I'm reporting an active federal crime in progress. Attempted forgery of military service documents." "Yes, I'll hold." The calls had already been made, though. The moment the general's name appeared on the Pentagon switchboard asking about a classified operative, alarms had sounded in buildings Katie had never been to, on secured lines that existed in spaces between official channels. Military intelligence had flagged the conversation before the general even finished describing what had happened. By 11:32 a.m., 2 FBI agents in dark suits were walking through the emergency room doors, their badges catching the antiseptic bright lights like evidence. They found Dr. Caldwell in his office. They'd done the homework already, they always did. They laid printed documents across his mahogany desk like a full house in a poker game he didn't know he was losing. His communications with the outside investigator. His calls to the board members. His contacts with her previous employers, those carefully selected references he'd chosen specifically because they'd been forced to give minimal information under classified directive. But there was something else. Something federal. Caldwell had attempted to access classified military personnel databases. Not once. Multiple times. Using credentials he'd falsified from the hospital's research department. Trying to manufacture documentation that Katie had never served, that her records were fabricated, that she was a fraud. That was the crime. That wasn't institutional politics anymore. That was federal. Dr. Caldwell, the lead agent said, her voice like someone reading a verdict they'd read 1,000 times before. "You're under investigation for attempted forgery of government documents and fraud. You have the right to remain silent." Caldwell's face did something strange. It went from the red of his usual indignation to the gray of someone watching the ground open beneath him. "I was just protecting patient safety," he said. His words came out in fragments. "She was unqualified. I was concerned about. You tried to forge military service records to justify terminating a decorated war hero," the agent interrupted. "That's a felony, Doctor." By afternoon, the hospital's legal team had suspended him pending investigation. By evening, the story had leaked, local news was already running with it, cameras catching footage of the emergency thoracotomy that the general had described in detail, staff members being interviewed on camera about what they'd witnessed, about the quiet nurse who'd performed an open-chest cardiac massage and brought a man back from the flat line. The general gave a statement from his hospital bed about Katie's service, her sacrifice, the operation that wasn't supposed to exist but that had saved his life. The hospital board called an emergency meeting and voted to terminate Caldwell effective immediately, severing all ties before the federal case could damage institutional reputation any further. The next morning, at 11:33 a.m. during the busiest hour, shift change, visitors flooding the lobbies, the cafeteria at maximum capacity. FBI agents arrested Dr. Caldwell in the hospital lobby. Handcuffs that caught the light like jewelry he didn't deserve. Miranda rights read with the flat authority of someone performing a ritual that had become routine. The perp walk from the elevators to the waiting sedan was captured by 20 phone cameras, the footage spreading across social media within minutes. Staff members who'd stood silently while he knocked trays from tables, who'd watched him humiliate the quiet nurse they now knew was a legend, suddenly found their voices on Reddit and TikTok. By sunset, Caldwell's name had been suspended from the hospital website. By midnight, he was a trending hashtag. Katie watched from the 4th floor, her face still unreadable, her composure intact. She pressed one hand against the window as they loaded him into the car. Just once. Then she turned back to her rounds. 6 months later, she stood in federal court wearing dress whites, Master Chief Petty Officer dress uniform, the kind with 6 rows of ribbons and the Navy Cross prominent on her chest like a second heart. She testified about Caldwell's attempts to access her classified records, his systematic campaign to destroy her career, his deliberate humiliation in front of staff and patients. The jury took 3 hours to deliberate. For counts of fraud. For counts of attempted forgery of government documents. Guilty on all counts. 18 months in federal prison. Permanent revocation of his medical license. Katie listened to the verdict without expression, then walked out of the courthouse into Portland rain that fell like applause. She drove past a strip mall on Southeast Morrison Street past the insurance storefront where Caldwell now sat at a folding table, business cards in a plastic holder, talking to an uninterested couple about premium rates and deductibles. His suit hung differently on him now, not tailored anymore, not expensive, just functional. He looked up as her car passed. Their eyes met for 1 second. Then she was gone. At Seattle General, her worn combat boots were displayed in a shadow box on the wall of honor in the main lobby, beside a written commendation from General Whitmore, now fully retired, who visited monthly for coffee in the cafeteria. The plaque beneath them read, Master Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez, Special Warfare Operator, United States Navy. Awarded commendations for valor. A warrior who chose to heal. Katie had been promoted to Clinical Director of Emergency Medicine, a position created specifically for her after the Pentagon had declassified portions of her service record. During grand rounds, she presented a case study on emergency thoracotomy techniques to 30 residents and attendings who hung on every word like she was translating scripture. Her voice had changed over those 6 months. It was deeper now, commanding, the voice of someone who no longer needed to apologize for taking up space. Afterward, in her office with its view of the city, she opened her desk drawer and touched the Bagram discharge paper she'd carried for 4 years, the one she'd never burned even when she should have. The general's words were framed on her wall, in his handwriting, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." Katie closed the drawer, put on her white coat, not scrubs anymore, not for administrative rounds, and walked back into the emergency room where she belonged, where a trauma alert was already screaming through the intercom. A motorcycle accident on I-405. 2 patients incoming. The hospital shifted to receive her like a ship recognizing its captain, and Katie Rodriguez moved through the controlled chaos with the grace of someone who'd already survived the worst and chosen to spend her second life saving others instead. Like and subscribe if you appreciate hardworking people who don't get the credit they deserve. Comment and tell us what you did for a living, or what you do now. Let's get into it.